everyone, and welcome back to another book review. Today, I am going to be reviewing Random Acts of Medicine. I listened to this book on audiobook format, so this is the audiobook record for me to show you because I will not have a physical book for this review. I do mention it's audiobook because I find that the format, the medium that I consume a book in, does impact my review of the book, and this is read by the authors. The book, well called Random Acts of Medicine, is focused on natural experiments, and I'm going to talk about what this book is about, what you can expect from this, and some of the interesting experiments that I read about, or listened to, I should say, in this book, as well as my thoughts on the book overall to make sure that it's a good fit for you if you're thinking about checking out this book. So when we go to the hospital or when we receive care, and this is particularly focused at US hospitals, but this applies in other places as well, we think that the care we get is the care we get. There's standards of medicine, these are doctors who have been trained, and we are getting a standard of care that is more or less universal. Mistakes happen, but there's care that's happening and it's occurring. Our health is something that we have control over, and it's going to happen in a certain way, and there's not much variation in that beyond maybe like our diet, our exercise, and that's about it. But the authors really go into all of these different factors that go into our health and the healthcare that we receive in the United States that have nothing to do with things that we traditionally think are under our sphere of influence. How much junk food you're eating, whether or not you are exercising, you're getting enough sleep, whether or not you drink or do any sort of drugs, any of that. Put those aside. That's not what this book is about. It's about all the factors we don't think about. Whether or not your cardiologist, your normal cardiologist, is out at a conference, whether or not there was a marathon going on recently, whether or not your doctor comes from the country you're in or has come from another area, the likelihood of being diagnosed with ADHD being linked with your birthday. All of these things that maybe we don't think about but have a big influence on our lives, or I should say can have a big influence on our lives. The focus of this book is on natural experiments, and a natural experiment isn't the peer-reviewed blind study that we think of that gets published in newspapers, or in academic journals, I should say, also reviewed in newspapers, but it's the kind of experiments that would absolutely probably never pass an IRB board review. They are the kind of experiments that in some cases are unethical to do, but that occur naturally in nature. So when we have two groups or two populations that have been naturally divided and there is a measurable difference that we can see between them. An example of this is, as a researcher, you can never say, I'm going to get 100 kids together, I want to divide them into two groups, and I want 50 of them to breathe in car pollution, all these horrible things coming out of the back end of a car for 4 years, and then we're going to test their math skills in school and see if they perform worse. No board is going to approve that experiment. It's unethical. You're intentionally trying to do harm to a group of people. That isn't going to fly. However, what we can do is say kids who have an address very, very close to a highway have probably been exposed to more car pollution. And then having this natural group of people that have been divided versus people who maybe live a mile or more away from the highway, we can look at their test score and see if there's any correlation between pollution that you have been exposed to and your school scores. So it's a population or an experiment that has naturally happened that may not be necessarily ethical to replicate or force to happen, but by it naturally occurring, we can draw very important experiments. Now, not all of the natural experiments are necessarily unethical to perform. They may not be thought to perform, or it may be kind of an odd experiment to perform, but once it has happened in the natural world, or in the natural course of events, I should say, it can lead to some very, very surprising results. So the couple examples I want to talk about, and I feel like every chapter in this book was really fascinating, so don't just think that these are the only interesting anecdotes in this book. There were many anecdotes and natural experiments, but I'm going to talk about some that I found interesting. The first is one that there's two kind of related, and this is one that I actually knew about. So hockey players are grouped to the United States in their little leagues based on the year they were born. So if you were born in January in a year, you might be put in the same, or you are put in the same hockey group as kids who were born in November of the same year. But when you think about child development, a kid born in January has 10 months over that kid born in November, and is going to be therefore much more developmentally developed when in this sports league, and therefore is likely to do better in hockey because they're just bigger than the other kids in the league and more developed and more skilled and more coordinated, and therefore more likely to find success overall in the sport of hockey. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And the authors relate this to kindergartners and the likelihood to be diagnosed with ADHD in kindergarten. And they find that children are more likely to be, so when you go into kindergarten in the United States, you have to have achieved a certain age by a cutoff. And now I do not have children of my own, so I don't really exactly know the cutoffs, but it's like you have to be age 5 by August 31st. But that August, let's say August 31st, 2024, let's give an example. You have to be 5. So if I have a child that turned 5 September 1st, 2023, they have to wait all the way until this school year to enter kindergarten, versus a child who was born August 29th, or who is turning 5 August 29th, 2024. They can also enter kindergarten. So these two kids, born almost a year apart, are entering kindergarten at the same time. And those kids who have birthdays who just made that cutoff actually perform worse in school. And this is worse in school in the sense that they're not as developed, they're not as ready to sit quietly, they're not as ready to absorb the material, and that is to be expected because development happens so quickly at that age. And this isn't, of course, a universal. There's probably plenty of kids who do just fine at that age, but by virtue of being almost a whole year younger versus the older kids in their class, they might struggle a little bit more. They might be referred to for behavioral issues that aren't necessarily really behavioral issues, or they may be issues that they would eventually outgrow, but instead they're kind of diverted down this course of being put on medication because that they might naturally not have needed if they had waited an extra year, because they're quite a bit younger and maybe not ready for the school environment. And this is, no matter where you put that date, it's going to, no matter where you put that cutoff, you're going to have those sort of odd events. So that's why hockey and kindergarten relate, because they both have an arbitrary cutoff that results in these two very disparate groups of kids being put together and expected to perform at the same level, leading to different levels of performance. The second one that I want to talk about, not the second one in the book, is what happens when there's a marathon in the city. So running is, of course, very good for us to do. It's healthy. I like to run. I like the way I feel after I run. But when you have a marathon, there's usually a lot of street shutdown. And so they look at diversions, people not being able to reach a hospital in time, and whether or not a marathon happening in a city impacts survival rates of people who are experiencing something like a heart attack, in which fast critical care is very, very important and definitely increases survival rates. So whether or not these blockages, and this could also be applied to things like construction, impact how fast you get to the hospital and your overall survival rate, because speed of getting to the hospital is very critical in your long-term survival rate when you have something like a heart attack happen. The third is when doctors are out on conference. So if you go to a hospital, maybe we're using again the heart attack example, if you go to a hospital with a heart attack and the cardiologist who is normally there is actually at a conference, interestingly enough, if you have like the secondary cardiologist or maybe people who are less experienced, you are more likely to survive. And they go into a whole interesting reason why that you can read about in the book, but it's a very unique and not intuitive result. You think the more researched, better, more knowledgeable people who are those cardiologists would give you the best chance of survival, but they go through a very interesting, well-reasoned approach onto why your survival rates are actually lower. And of course, this is again a experiment that might not be easy to run, but it's naturally occurring, and so they're able to pull these interesting results. They also, on the topic of doctors, talk about the chance of making a mistake during an operation, which humans are mistakes. Whoa. Humans make mistakes. Humans are not mistakes. Humans make mistakes. Doctors are humans, so doctors make mistakes. But when doctors are operating on their birthday, they actually make more mistakes. And so they talk about how distraction plays a role in doctors' operating skills and how they're human just like everyone else, and we can't separate personal life from professional life 100%, leading to situations like this. And that's another thing that might be hard to run an experiment on, but is able to be done with this natural experiment method looking at the data. Finally, one that was very interesting to me is this section that talked about palliative care. So when someone has been diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer that is believed to be terminal, you have kind of different options. You can continue to aggressively treat the cancer, and this goes for other things as well. The example in the book was just a form of cancer. you can choose to aggressively keep treating the cancer because there are survival rates that are maybe single digits, but you have an option to keep fighting, or you can elect to not aggressively treat the disease and instead choose to go for this palliative or hospice care, which is just more about making your life comfortable, alleviating symptoms, and ensuring that the time you have left is done doing things that you actually enjoy. And they found, very interestingly enough, that those who took palliative care, so people who chose to not start aggressively fighting the disease, lived longer than people who chose to keep fighting the disease aggressively. And they go into a lot of the nuance and what could be happening here, but I felt like that was another really interesting data point. Overall, the authors did a really good job talking through the experiment, much better than what I'm doing here. They were able to very clearly walk through what happened step by step and address what if this was the cause? How do we know this isn't the cause? And they went at that level of detail through every experiment, which I found to be very, very helpful. I think that when talking to people who might not have background in statistics or scientific studies, it's very helpful to go step by step. And I found it very, very clear because when I was listening to this audiobook, they would say that this had happened. And I would think, well, maybe it was caused by cause A, B, or C. And then the author would almost, like reading my mind, say, well, we're going to explain why it isn't caused by A, B, and C. And go very, very clearly explaining where they got the data, how they did the modeling, how they drew their conclusions. And overall, I was very, very impressed with them talking through the experiments. I also felt like they drew from a wide range of interesting topics. So I just pulled a small handful to talk about in this review, but there are a lot of interesting topics and all of them were fascinating. And so I felt like the variety was in there, and the authors also did a really good ratio of anecdotes to statistics and data. So it kept the book very interesting and not a very academic read. And on that note, I feel like this was very accessible to me as someone who doesn't work in medicine, who doesn't have any background in that, because the anecdotes to data was clearly balanced and the explanation of the experiments was well done. So I didn't feel like I was wading through a medical text that was written for someone who already had background in the field, which I also really, really appreciated. Overall, this was an interesting book. I have to say, it wasn't a book that I was always reaching for. I wasn't like, oh, I can't wait to get home and wash the dishes and fold the laundry and listen to Random Acts of Medicine. But once I put it on, once I was like, oh, I have to fold all this laundry, I'm gonna put my audiobook on, I was like listening to it, and I kept trying to find chores to do around the house so I could keep listening to the audiobook because it was interesting. So I felt like the pickup factor, in the sense that like me wanting to pick the book up, was low. I've always felt like it was never like, oh, I should listen to the audiobook. But when I got started listening to the audiobook, every time I did, it's like I couldn't stop. So I don't know what that disconnect is there, and I do find there are books like that where I struggle to pick it up out of interest, but once I'm in it, I find it very, very interesting and I can't stop. I find that more often with audiobooks, so I do think it's maybe like a format thing where maybe I don't want to pick up an audiobook and listen to it, or there's just a little bit more friction to me picking up audiobooks and listening to it. But once I pick up the audiobook, it's very, very fascinating. It's hard for me to put it down. I wonder if I would have had that experience with not wanting to pick it up, but once I'm reading it, I enjoy it. If I had read the print book, but I listened to the audiobook, so I wanted to be clear on that due to the format that I listened to it in. If you've read Random Acts of Medicine, have any thoughts or feedback, then this could be a perfect section for you to leave your comments down below. If you are interested in natural experiments, this could be a great book for you. And if this book was interesting to you, you may also want to check out my review on the nocebo effect, which was another very, very fascinating book from the medical field, but presented to a non-medical audience that I read recently and I really enjoyed, and that will be linked at the end of this video. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.